The sun
My
had
Apache
barely
sun
crested the
started,
jagged
sir.
peaks of the Chiricahua
Let me
Mountains
serve you
when
in
Maria
exchange for a
Delgado
loaf of bread.
stepped onto the dusty main street of Tombstone, Arizona territory. The year was 1882, and the mining town buzzed with the constant din of prospectors, merchants, and drifters seeking their fortunes in the unforgiving desert. Maria clutched her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, not against the morning chill, but to steady her trembling hands. Behind her, in the cramped adobe dwelling she called home, her 7-year-old son Miguel lay on a threadbare blanket, his small frame growing thinner with each passing day. Half Apache through his father's bloodline, the boy bore the striking features of both worlds, his mother's Spanish heritage evident in his olive skin and dark hair, while his father's Apache ancestry showed in his high cheekbones and keen, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom far beyond his years. Maria had watched those eyes grow dimmer over the past 3 weeks as their meager food supplies dwindled to nothing. The drought had been merciless this year, destroying what little crop she managed to grow behind their small home. Her husband, Joaquin, had been killed 6 months earlier in a skirmish between Apache raiders and the territorial militia, caught in the crossfire while trying to negotiate peace between the two sides. As a mixed-blood family, they belonged fully to neither world, accepted by few and trusted by even fewer. The streets of Tombstone were already alive with activity despite the early hour. Wagons loaded with silver ore rumbled past, kicking up clouds of red dust that settled on everything like a fine coating of despair. Saloon doors swung open intermittently, releasing the stale smell of whiskey and tobacco into the crisp morning air. Maria walked with purpose, though her destination filled her with a mixture of hope and dread. She had heard through whispered conversations among the Mexican women who worked as seamstresses and laundresses that Cornelius Whitman, the town's most prosperous merchant, was looking for domestic help. Whitman owned the largest general store in Tombstone, a 2-story building that dominated the corner of Allen and 4th Street. His wealth was evident not just in his business holdings, but in the fine clothes he wore, the elaborate mustache he kept perfectly waxed, and the gold pocket watch that caught the sunlight as he conducted his daily affairs. What Maria had also heard, though spoken in even quieter tones, was that Whitman harbored a particular disdain for the Apache people. His own brother had been killed in an Apache raid near Tucson 2 years prior, and since then, Whitman had been vocal in his support for the government's efforts to confine all Apache to reservations, regardless of their individual circumstances or peaceful intentions. As Maria approached Whitman's store, she could see him through the large front window, arranging merchandise on shelves with the precision of a man who counted every penny. He was a tall, angular figure in his mid-40s, with graying hair slicked back and a stern expression that seemed permanently etched into his weathered features. His hands moved efficiently as he worked, occasionally pausing to make notes in a leather-bound ledger. Maria paused at the corner, gathering her courage. In her pocket, she carried the last possession of any value she owned, a silver cross that had belonged to her grandmother, passed down through generations of women who had faced their own impossible choices. She had hoped to trade it for food, but even the pawnbroker had offered her barely enough for a single meal. What she needed was steady work, regular income, and the chance to feed her son properly. Taking a deep breath, Maria pushed open the heavy wooden door of Whitman's store. A small bell chimed overhead, announcing her arrival. The interior was impressive by frontier standards, shelves lined with everything from bolts of fabric and household goods to tools and preserved foods. The wooden floors were swept clean, and the morning light streaming through the windows illuminated dust motes dancing in the air like tiny spirits. Whitman looked up from his ledger, his pale blue eyes immediately taking in Maria's appearance. She had done her best to present herself respectably, braiding her long black hair and wearing her cleanest dress, though the fabric showed signs of repeated mending and the inevitable wear of poverty. Her hands, though clean, bore the calluses and small scars of a woman who had worked hard her entire life. "May I help you?" Whitman asked, his tone neutral but not unkind. He set down his pen and regarded her with the practiced assessment of a businessman evaluating a potential transaction. "Senor Whitman," Maria began, her English careful and deliberate. Though she spoke both Spanish and Apache fluently, English remained her third language, and she wanted to make sure her words were understood clearly. "I have heard that you might be in need of someone to help in your store, or perhaps in your home." Whitman's eyebrows rose slightly. He had indeed been considering hiring additional help, particularly for the domestic duties at his large house on the hill overlooking the town. His wife, Elizabeth, had been complaining about the burden of managing their household alone, especially with their frequent entertaining of other prominent town members and visiting business associates. "I might be," he replied cautiously. "What experience do you have?" Maria straightened her shoulders, drawing upon a dignity that poverty could not diminish. "I have managed my own household for many years, senor. I can cook, clean, sew, and tend to laundry. I'm honest, hard-working, and I learn quickly. I ask only for fair wages and perhaps some food to take home to my son." At the mention of her son, something shifted almost imperceptibly in Whitman's expression. He had heard the gossip around town about the Mexican woman who lived in the small adobe near the edge of the settlement. Some said her husband had been Apache. Others claimed he was simply a Mexican who had dealings with the local tribes. Either way, in a town where tensions ran high between the white settlers and the indigenous peoples, any association with the Apache made one suspect. "Your son," Whitman said slowly, leaning back against his counter. "How old is he?" 7 years, senor. He's a good boy, quiet and respectful. He would not be any trouble." "And his father?" Maria's hands tightened around her shawl. This was the question she had dreaded, the one that could end any possibility of employment before it truly began. But she had raised Miguel to be proud of his heritage, all of it, and she would not deny her husband's memory now. "His father was my husband, Joaquin Delgado. He was killed 6 months ago while trying to make peace between the Apache and the militia. He was a good man who believed that understanding between our peoples was possible." Whitman's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Was he Apache? The question hung in the air between them, like smoke from a gun barrel. Maria met his gaze steadily, her dark eyes reflecting a strength born of necessity and loss. "His grandmother was Apache, yes, but he was also Mexican, and our son is also my son, with Spanish blood running through his veins. He is an American child, born on American soil, and he is hungry, Senor Whitman. That is what matters most to me now." For a long moment, the two stood in silence. Outside, the sounds of Tombstone's daily life continued. Horses' hooves on packed earth, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer, voices calling out greetings and conducting business. But inside the store, time seemed suspended as Whitman considered Maria's words. Finally, he spoke. "I won't lie to you, Mrs. Delgado. The fact that your son has Apache blood makes this complicated. There are people in this town who wouldn't take kindly to me employing someone with those connections." Maria felt her heart sink, but she forced herself to remain upright, to maintain the dignity that was sometimes all she had left. "However," Whitman continued, and Maria's breath caught in her throat, "I am also a businessman, and I judge people by their actions, not their ancestry. If you can do the work I need done, and do it well, then we might be able to come to an arrangement." Hope flickered in Maria's chest, like a candle flame in a gentle breeze, fragile but growing stronger. "What would you need me to do, senor?" "My wife needs help managing our household. We have a large home, and she often hosts dinners for important visitors to Tombstone. The work would involve cooking, cleaning, serving at dinner parties, and general household management. The hours would be long, especially when we have guests, but the pay would be regular." Maria nodded eagerly. "I can do all of those things, senor. I am not afraid of hard work." "The position would also require discretion," Whitman added, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "My wife and I discuss business matters, and anyone working in our home would inevitably overhear sensitive information." I would need your absolute assurance that nothing you hear would be repeated outside our house. You have my word, Signor Whitman. I understand the importance of trust. Whitman studied her face for another moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. I'll offer you a trial period of 2 weeks. If your work is satisfactory, we'll discuss a permanent arrangement. You would work 6 days a week, from dawn until after the evening meal is cleaned up. Sundays would be your own. I'll pay you $3 a week, plus you may take home leftover food after our meals. $3 a week was more than Maria had dared to hope for. Combined with the food, it would be enough to ensure that Miguel could eat regularly, perhaps even gain back some of the weight he had lost. Thank you, Signor Whitman. When would you like me to start? Tomorrow morning. Be at our house at sunrise. It's the large white house with green shutters at the top of the hill on Fremont Street. You can't miss it. Maria felt tears threatening to spill from her eyes, but she blinked them back. I will be there, Signor. Thank you for this opportunity. As she turned to leave, Whitman called out to her, Mrs. Delgado? She turned back to face him. I meant what I said about discretion and about judging people by their actions. Don't make me regret this decision. I won't, Signor. You have my word. Maria left the store with a lightness in her step that she hadn't felt in months. For the first time since Joaquin's death, she had hope, real, tangible hope for her and Miguel's future. She hurried home, eager to share the news with her son and to prepare for her first day of work. But as she walked through the dusty streets of Tombstone, she was unaware of the conversation taking place in the shadows of the alley beside Whitman's store. 2 men had been listening to her exchange with the merchant, and their expressions were far from pleased. Did you hear that, Jake? The taller of the 2 men said to his companion. Whitman's gone and hired himself an Apache squaw. Jake Morrison, a grizzled prospector who had lost his own brother in an Apache raid the previous year, spat into the dirt. That's what it sounded like to me, Tom. And here I thought Cornelius had more sense than that. Tom Bradley, a frequent patron of Tombstone's saloons and a man known for his loud opinions on the Indian problem, shook his head in disgust. Mark my words, Jake. No good will come of this. You can't trust any of them, Apache, not even the women and children. They're all savages at heart. Maybe we ought to have a word with some of the other boys about this, Jake suggested. Folks should know what kind of people Whitman's bringing into his house, especially when he's got access to information about silver shipments and such. That's exactly what I was thinking, Tom agreed. We'll spread the word quiet-like, let people draw their own conclusions. Won't be long before Whitman realizes his mistake. The 2 men melted back into the shadows, their conversation ending as abruptly as it had begun. Neither of them noticed the small figure pressed against the wall of the building across the street, a young Apache boy named Running Wolf, who worked odd jobs around town and who had heard every word of their exchange. Running Wolf was one of the few Apache children who had managed to avoid being sent to the San Carlos reservation, living instead with his elderly grandfather in a small camp in the hills outside Tombstone. The old man, known as White Bear, had once been a respected medicine man among his people, but age and the changing times had left him increasingly isolated from both the Apache community and the white settlers. The boy had come to town early that morning to see if any of the merchants needed help loading wagons or cleaning their stores, work that paid little, but sometimes included a meal or small coins. He had been about to approach Whitman's store when he saw the Mexican woman enter, and curiosity had led him to position himself where he could overhear the conversation. Now, as he watched the 2 white men disappear into the maze of Tombstone's side streets, Running Wolf felt a familiar knot of fear and anger in his stomach. He had seen what happened when white men decided that Apache people or anyone associated with them posed a threat to their community. The results were never good. The boy waited until he was certain the men were gone, then began the long walk back to his grandfather's camp. He had much to think about, and an important decision to make. The Mexican woman seemed kind, and she had spoken of her son with the same protective love that Running Wolf remembered in his own mother's voice before she died of the white man's disease 2 winters past. As he climbed the rocky path leading away from Tombstone, Running Wolf's young mind was already formulating a plan. His grandfather had always taught him that the Apache way was to watch, to listen, and to act when action was needed to protect those who could not protect themselves. The Mexican woman and her son were not Apache, but they carried Apache blood, and in the harsh world of the Arizona Territory, that made them family of a sort. Meanwhile, Maria had reached her small adobe home, her heart still racing with excitement and relief. She pushed open the wooden door, its hinges creaking in protest, and stepped into the dim interior. The single room that served as their entire living space was sparse but clean, containing little more than 2 sleeping pallets, a small table, 2 chairs, and a corner area where Maria prepared their meals over a small fire pit. Miguel lay on his pallet, his thin frame barely making an impression in the worn blankets. His large, dark eyes turned toward his mother as she entered, and Maria was struck once again by how much older than his years he appeared. Hunger and loss had stolen much of his childhood innocence, replacing it with a premature understanding of hardship. "Mama," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "did you find work?" Maria knelt beside her son's pallet, reaching out to smooth his black hair away from his forehead. His skin felt warm, but not feverish, a good sign, though she could see that he had grown even thinner in the few hours she had been gone. "Yes, mijo," she said, her voice filled with a joy she hadn't felt in months. "I found work with Senor Whitman, the man who owns the big store in town. I will be helping his wife with their house and they will pay me well. We will have food again, real food, every day." Miguel's eyes brightened for the first time in weeks, and a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Every day, Mama? Every day," Maria confirmed, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "And I start tomorrow, so by tomorrow night I will bring home good food for both of us. You will grow strong again, I promise." The boy nodded, his small hand reaching out to grasp his mother's fingers. "Will I be able to go to school again?" The question pierced Maria's heart. Miguel had been attending the small schoolhouse in Tombstone until 3 months ago, when she could no longer afford the small fee required for books and supplies. The boy was naturally intelligent, quick to learn both English and arithmetic, and his absence from school had been one of the many sacrifices their poverty had demanded. "Perhaps," Maria said carefully, "let us see how the work goes first. But yes, mijo, I hope that you will be able to return to school soon." Miguel nodded again, seemingly satisfied with this answer. At 7 years old, he had already learned not to push too hard for promises that might be difficult to keep. His mature acceptance of their circumstances both impressed and saddened Maria, who wished her son could have the carefree childhood that seemed reserved for other children. "Now," Maria said, forcing brightness into her voice, "I must prepare for tomorrow. I want to make sure I do good work for Senor and Senora Whitman." She spent the remainder of the day cleaning and mending her clothes, preparing herself as best she could for her new position. As evening approached, she shared their last piece of stale bread with Miguel, both of them eating slowly to make the meager meal last as long as possible. That night, as Miguel slept beside her on their shared pallet, Maria lay awake, staring at the rough wooden beams of their ceiling. Hope and anxiety warred in her chest as she thought about the day ahead. She had told Whitman the truth about her abilities and her work ethic, but she knew that being competent would not be enough if the people of Tombstone decided they didn't want an Apache-connected family living among them. She thought of Joaquin, of the dreams they had shared for their son's future. Her husband had believed that understanding between the different peoples of the territory was not only possible, but necessary for everyone's survival. He had worked tirelessly to build bridges between communities, translating not just languages, but cultures, helping Apache and Mexican and American peoples find common ground. His death had been a cruel irony, killed while trying to prevent violence between the very groups he had spent his life trying to unite. The territorial militia had claimed he was aiding Apache raiders, while some Apache had viewed his cooperation with white authorities as betrayal. In the end, he had satisfied no one and paid the ultimate price for his idealism. But Maria had never regretted marrying him, never regretted the choices that had led to Miguel's birth. Her son was the best of all their worlds, intelligent like his father, resilient like his Apache ancestors, and compassionate in the way she hoped all their combined heritage could produce. As sleep finally began to claim her, Maria whispered a prayer to the Virgin of Guadalupe, asking for strength and protection for the challenges that lay ahead. She didn't know that in the hills outside Tombstone, an old Apache medicine man named White Bear was conducting his own prayers, guided by the urgent words of his grandson, Running Wolf. The boy had arrived at their camp just before sunset, breathless from his rapid climb up the mountain path. He had quickly related everything he had overheard: Maria's conversation with Whitman, the subsequent discussion between the two hostile white men, and his own growing concern for the safety of the Mexican woman and her Apache-blooded son. White Bear had listened in silence, his weathered hands working automatically to prepare his evening meal while his mind processed the information. At 73 years old, he had seen the destruction that fear and hatred could bring to innocent people. He had also seen the power that came from unexpected alliances between those whom society tried to keep apart. "What should we do, grandfather?" Running Wolf had asked as they sat beside their small fire, the lights of Tombstone twinkling in the valley below them. White Bear had been quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on the distant glow of the mining town. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of wisdom earned through decades of survival in a changing world. "We watch," he said simply. "We listen. And when the time comes to act, we will know what must be done." The old man understood something that the younger generation sometimes forgot, that survival often depended not on strength or weapons, but on knowing when to remain hidden and when to step into the light. The Mexican woman had taken a brave step by seeking work with Whitman, but her courage alone might not be enough to protect her family from the prejudices that ran deep in frontier communities. As the fire burned low and Running Wolf settled into sleep, White Bear remained awake, his senses attuned to the sounds of the desert night. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the old medicine man took it as a sign that the spirits were watching over all those who faced uncertain futures. Dawn was still hours away, but already the events of the coming day were being set in motion by forces both seen and unseen. In her small adobe home, Maria slept fitfully, dreaming of her son's face filled with health and happiness. In the grand house on Fremont Street, Cornelius Whitman lay beside his wife, wondering if he had made the right decision in hiring the Mexican woman. And in the shadows of Tombstone's saloons and boarding houses, Tom Bradley and Jake Morrison continued their whispered campaign, planting seeds of suspicion and fear that would soon take root in the fertile ground of frontier prejudice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only Maria's determination to provide for her son, but the very principles upon which the growing community of Tombstone claimed to be built. In a place where silver and opportunity drew people from across the nation and beyond, the question of who truly belonged would soon demand an answer that might come at a higher cost than anyone was prepared to pay. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the desert landscape, Maria stirred on her pallet, her body automatically responding to years of rising before the sun. Today would mark the beginning of either her family's salvation or a new chapter in their struggle for acceptance in a world that seemed determined to see them as outsiders. But regardless of what lay ahead, she would face it with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through every previous trial. For Miguel, for the memory of Joaquin, and for the hope that love and determination could triumph over hatred and fear, Maria Delgado was ready to fight whatever battles the day might bring.